Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be discussing The Prisoners of Geography, 10 Maps That Tell You Everything You Need to Know About Global Politics by Tim Marshall. And I just have to say, wow, why didn't I read this book sooner? Now, I don't want to give you the impression this book was written a very long time ago. First published 2015, this edition's 2016, and I think there's been an updated edition since the war in Ukraine has started recently in 2022, this year. So I wish I'd read it sooner, but it isn't as if it's been around a long time. And I've read books that cover some of the ideas around this. For example, Who Lost Russia by Peter Conradi covers a large portion, covers more than is adequate for the Russia portion of this book. However, the clues of the name, geography, the idea that it doesn't matter who the politicians are, what the form of government in a nation state is, what the ethnicities of the people are, that the Himalayas are still the Himalayas, and they separate China and India, and that creates a problem between those two countries. And this book goes through 10 different maps: Russia, China, the United States, Western Europe, Africa, the Middle East, India and Pakistan, Korea and Japan, Latin America, and the Arctic. Now, there are varying interests to the reader. I think, obviously, if a reader is from the Middle East, he or she is going to be a lot more interested in what Marshall has to say about that region. But even if you're not, if you're just generally interested in the world, I don't think you need to be interested in politics. I think you just need to be open to the idea that there is something else other than politics, form of government, the zeitgeist that influences world events. And this book, I think, just really changed the paradigm for me, really woke me up to the idea of the power of geography. And in fact, there's another book, Power of Geography, which I'll be reading hopefully later this year. It's been bumped up my TBR after reading this book by Marshall. I'm not going to talk about all of the maps because there's not enough time to do that in this video, but I'm going to highlight a few of them. The Russia chapter, I think, is essential reading for people who want to know why this current proxy war between Russia and the United States is happening in Ukraine. It's due in large part to NATO aggression in terms of moving its borders forward into a country that traditionally has not done well with aggression. And I think it's never good to put someone into a corner. When you put someone into a corner, they don't have anything to lose, and they'll lash out, and big surprise, this is where we are now. We're heading towards probably what is going to be the worst non-war winter in Europe. People are having predictions about what's going to happen. I have no idea. I'm only going to be here for parts of this winter anyway, but we'll see what happens. But that chapter that talks about Russia is post the Crimea annexation of 2014, when Crimea had voted democratically to join Russia, and that was not recognized, quote unquote, by the great and the good people. However, that was a referendum. Anyone who thinks that the majority of people in Crimea would want to be part of Ukraine just isn't familiar with the reality of who lives in Crimea. The idea that Russia would give up the lease on its nuclear submarine base, on its military naval base in Sevastopol, isn't tied to reality. So that whole problem in Ukraine has a geographic component as well, which I think will only enrich your understanding of the situation. China, the China chapter, doesn't just give you insight into why China is where it is, but it also gives you some insight into Tibet and the reach into Kashmir. But what else is surprising is China shows up pretty much everywhere else. In the Africa chapter, you'll see just how much China is playing the long game and finding other allies and not relying on the current paradigm of U.S.-led NATO supremacy. And all things past, China's a 5,000-year-old nation. So they know that empires come and go, treaties come and go, or international organizations come and go. But what matters is the friends you make. And China's making a lot of friends. So really intriguing chapter on China. Africa, that he goes through many countries, but DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, which is neither democratic nor republic nor really Congo, it I think is an interesting analog for the rest of the continent, in which you have something highly dysfunctional and you have predatory outside powers who are not interested in ameliorating the situation, but simply taking the resources they need and getting out. Just saying, hey, you people fix it yourself. There is no one who has taken an interest in resolving the situation in Africa. And even if they did, they would be accused of neocolonialism, because you aren't allowed to help someone who isn't your countryman without being racist or whatever else. That this strange idea that you can only help someone if you're their race or you speak their language. It's a poison we have from this anti-colonialism rhetoric that you'll hear. For the record, I am not an anti-colonialist. I'm very much a colonialist in terms of, I think colonialism has brought a lot of good, but I also am willing to recognize that there have been excesses and great evils that have resulted. But that's how it is with every endeavor in human existence. What happened when cars were introduced? Masses of families were wiped out in terms of who were involved in the horse business. All the people who raised horses, everyone who made buggies for horses, they got wiped out massively by cars. Or were we crying about the introduction of the car? There are advances and there are movements in human existence that are not always 100% net positive. But I would say far and away, colonialism's positives so much outweigh the negatives. And we have to look at the negatives often as perpetrated by individuals or as bad actors within state governments of some of the colonial powers, not all of them. That's a different discussion, but it is lingering in the background of a lot of these chapters. Also, with the Middle East, even more blatantly, Pikes-Seko, the line that was arbitrarily drawn for Syria, all of those essentially fake borders that were drawn in the Middle East by the West that separated people who lived together tribally by some arbitrary line says, oh, now you're in Iraq or now you're in Syria, and that these countries as they are did not exist. For Jordan, there's another country, Saudi Arabia, which is just taking the family's name and making it the name of the country, which is another strange, crazy concept. But the Middle East, part of the reason we continue to harvest problems in the Middle East is because of the borders that we drew, which also ties to geography. Also, the Korea-Japan chapter, fascinating to this day, and I've talked to people about this I've talked to people from Korea and Japan who confirm what this book alludes to, that Koreans are still very much looked down on in Japan. They are the lower class workers of that country, and it's a shame to marry into a Korean family if you're Japanese. That is a major problem given their geographic proximity. It would be like Mexico and the United States not being friends. And what sort of problems would that cause if you're an American and you're trying to think about that? For Americans, the American chapter hammers home, if it hasn't been manifestly obvious to you, how blessed the United States is in terms of its natural resources and having a friendly neighbor up north who, apologizes all the time, would never attack us, and a failed state to the south. So North America, it's not surprising that the United States became a superpower because we had no natural predators, no natural predators in our part of the world. And then we enforced this crazy Monroe Doctrine with our southern neighbors and helped to screw up South America as well. America cannot help meddling wherever possible, and it's a great shame. That's a different video, different discussion. Finally, India and Pakistan, another chapter. As I said, I didn't talk about every chapter in the book. These are just the ones that I was most interested in. India and Pakistan. Wow, what an interesting chapter. I'm fascinated by the history of that region. But I think I didn't understand how dire Pakistan's position was. I thought, okay, well, they've got nukes and they've got a well-trained military. But what this means is they're always frozen in fear looking at India. expecting to get into a war with them and not really coming to grips with the reality that they'll get murdered. It would be a terrible situation. Or you'll have a nuclear exchange, and then that part of the world zapped for a long time. So can't recommend this enough to get a better sense of what's around you in the world. I often say I don't read the news because it doesn't matter. It's not really relevant. It doesn't. There's often not anything I can do about it, and the news is whatever the media wants you to believe is the news. But I think this is the sort of current event reading, I don't even know if I feel comfortable calling it that, but let's say affairs of the world reading that really matters, that tells you, that refers to not just history and anthropology, but geography, something that we don't often talk about. And I think a lot of people got really interested in that field after reading this text. I'm certainly one of them. I'm going to be following up and reading more of his stuff. Anyway, Prisoners of Geography, Tim Marshall, pick it up, read it. You won't regret it. If you'd like, I'll put a link to it in the video description so you can support our work. You could also support me on Patreon. There's a link to that. As usual, like if you like the video, subscribe. If you didn't like the video, leave a comment. Tell me why you didn't like the video or why Tim Marshall is full of it. But until next time, enjoy your reading.